Здравствуйте, товарищи! Welcome to SSSR, Super Sekretnya Stabilnya Raketa, where I recreate historic Russian spacecraft in Kerbal Space Program and where we look at the fascinating history of Russian spaceflight. In the previous episode, we looked at the many achievements of the Soviet lunar program. Click on the icon in the upper right hand corner if you want to watch that and maybe give it a thumbs up. In this episode we will focus on a special piece of equipment that could have won the moon race for the Russians. Today we're going to fly the N1. If you enjoy space-related things, ludicrous spacecraft designs and/or the game Kerbal Space Program, make sure to subscribe to this channel and click on the little bell. Crash! The bell. So you will get notified of new episodes in this series. I promise I will try to make it worth your while. Where were we? The moon. Ah yes, the moon. Cosmic companion of Earth and a constant inspiration for countless science fiction stories. It also served as a means of gaining political victories during the Cold War. This is where the N1 rocket comes in. After the successes of the Soviet space program in the 1950s, lead designer Sergei Korolyov and his design bureau OKB-1 began development of a mega rocket. It was designed to be a multi-purpose launcher serving military and scientific needs, maybe even launching humans to Mars one day. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. The N1 was greenlit by the Kremlin with the goal to beat the Americans to the moon. Although the final approval for sending cosmonauts to the moon was given later in 1964, 3 years after US President John F. Kennedy's historic speech in which he promised to his people that the United States would put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. Americans and their speeches. After multiple iterations, the designers around Korolyov decided on the N1 as we know it. A towering rocket with multiple stages similar to the American Saturn V, yet still very different. It was a bit shorter than the US moon rocket, standing 105 meters tall compared to the Saturn V's almost 111 meters. The N1 also featured a cone-like shape compared to the cylindrical American rocket. Both had an enormous launch mass, 2,750 and 2,970 tons respectively. The N1 had higher thrust on the first stage, but the Saturn V used liquid hydrogen instead of kerosene in its upper stages, which resulted in a much higher specific impulse and therefore enabling the American rocket to launch double the payload of the N1 into low Earth orbit. 140 tons on a Saturn V compared to the expected 75 tons on the N1. Due to this limitation, Korolyov wanted to perform multiple launches of the N1 and assemble a lunar complex in Earth orbit before sending it to the moon. This would also involve something unheard of until that point, refueling a vehicle in orbit. For this, the 21K tanker vehicle was designed. It alone was expected to have a mass of around 75 tons, 65 of which would be propellant for refueling. 2 of these tankers were planned to be sent up on the N1 each. Prior to that, yet another N1 would have delivered the lander and translunar injection stage. This was apparently known as the 19K vehicle, but information about that was very hard to find. After using the 2 21K tankers to refuel it, another launch would bring a 7K vehicle, basically an upgraded Soyuz, into orbit, which would then dock with the 19K. The entire complex was designed to fly directly to the lunar surface without any orbital rendezvous like the Apollo mission. Unfortunately, I could not find any reliable information on the 19K, let alone pictures, so I got creative.
Not so fast. Just while I was putting the finishing touches on this video, Russian space aficionado Anatoly Zak released this article on his site russianspaceweb.com, where he details how the 19K would have worked. Some of his renderings are based on assumptions, for instance the maneuvering tug. Also, he states the 19K would launch after the 21K tankers were already in orbit. The most bonkers thing about it, though, and it is almost Kerbal, is the fact that the Soyuz Type 7K vehicle is docked upside down. It looks a bit funny, but there's some logic to it, come to think of it. If the crew had to use an off-docking port, they would not be able to look out the window to better see what's going on. It also spared the Soviets the hassle of redesigning the vehicle even further. So what I will show you does not really reflect the real design. In reality, this here would be a more faithful recreation. But I think since the mission itself is valid, let's roll with it.
My first iteration was truly Kerbal and would enclose the entire 7K within the lander vehicle, but this had a few issues, besides being sort of a bouncy castle. First, in reality it would have been wise to split this into an injection stage and a lander stage. Also, enclosing a 7K vehicle would have made the 19K bulkier than I believe was possible for N1 fairings. My next iteration was a relatively normal stack with 2 stages. This would require the 7K to also include an aft docking port. After the 21K tankers had replenished the 7K with kerosene and oxygen, the 7K vehicle would be attached and the entire assembly sent to the moon. The injection stage would be ditched and the combination of 19K and 7K lander would touch down on the lunar surface. Cosmonauts would perform their experiments and possibly plant the Soviet flag. Then cosmonauts would return to Earth in their 7K Soyuz variant. An ambitious plan, to say the least. However, this plan was rejected by Soviet leadership, necessitating a redesign of what later became known as the L3 lunar complex. The Kremlin had regarded Korolyov's initial plan as too expensive. Expensive. Not only that, they also skimped on financing a test stand for the many stages of the N1. That was one of the reasons why all of the launch attempts were so risky, and probably the main reason why all of them failed in the end. Still, a mission was designed. It centered around a very small one-man lander craft called the LK, and the aforementioned 7K Soyuz variant for transporting the cosmonauts and returning them home. The N1's stages were numbered bottom to top after the Russian alphabet. A, B, V.
Then the first part of the lunar complex, block G,
D, Y, and E, which actually skips a few letters. Block A, the first stage, was powered by a whopping 30 NK-15 engines. Those were newly developed by the Kuznetsov Design Bureau, which up until that point had only developed aircraft engines. As you may know, the NK-15 engines were ahead of their time, using closed-cycle technology to reach levels of efficiency unheard of until even the late 1990s. There's even an entire documentary about it, so I won't go into much detail, but there's a link in the description if you want to know more. Safe to say, the engines were remarkable, and their successor, the NK-33, still is. But there were still a lot of kinks to iron out during the development of the N1. To keep so many engines under control, the Russians developed CORD, an acronym for Kontrol Raketnik Dvigatel, which literally means control of rocket engines. Should any of its many sensors detect an engine failure, the system would automatically shut down the faulty and the opposing engine to keep the rocket stable. Unfortunately, while the idea was good, the implementation was not, as the multiple launch failures have shown. On the first attempt in February 1969, the first stage caught fire, and the CORD system shut down all 30 engines while simultaneously locking the upper stages, preventing ground control from at least trying to start them. Еще раз! Attempt number 2 was launched on July 3rd, 1969 and proved to be even more catastrophic. One of the turbopumps pumping liquid oxygen into an NK-15 engine exploded, which then led to CORD shutting down all except one engine. The rocket tilted over and perished in a gigantic explosion that completely destroyed the launch complex and threw debris as far as 10 kilometers from the launch site. Even 40 kilometers away from the launch site, windows burst due to the blast. It is regarded as one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions in history. And yet, Only around 15% of the N1's entire propellant on board had detonated. But the Soviets were determined to succeed, and they still had one launch pad left, so... Еще раз! The third attempt took place on June 26, 1971. Only a short while after liftoff, the rocket started to roll uncontrollably. The Kort control system would have shut down the first stage, but one of the improvements was to prevent the system to do so during the first 50 seconds after launch. When it finally reached the timestamp, the system reacted, resulting in the rocket plummeting to the ground a few kilometers from the launch site. Еще раз! November 23, 1972, the final launch attempt of the mighty N1. The first segment of the launch went off well. After 90 seconds, 6 core engines would shut down to reduce structural stress on the rocket. But due to the abrupt shutdown, fuel lines burst and a fire broke out. Block A disintegrated 107 seconds after launch. But at least the launch escape system pulled the functional Soyuz vehicle on top to safety. Sadly, or maybe luckily for him, Korolev did not see his mighty creation fail. The man responsible for getting Sputnik off the ground and putting the first man and woman into space died on January 14, 1966, after a routine surgery performed a few days prior. He was already suffering from many health problems prior to this, including a heart attack and kidney disorder. Some of these were likely due to long-term issues caused by his many years in prison and even a Siberian gulag as a result of the Stalinist Great Purge during the late 1930s. Since all N1 launches failed while still on the first stage, we do not know whether or not the upper stages would have worked correctly. Also, the space race was already won by the Americans. The Soviet manned moon program was cancelled and the N1 was scrapped. But let's imagine it wasn't. Let's look at what an actual Russian mission to the moon would have looked like had it succeeded. Block A, with its 30 engines, would have lifted the massive vehicle from the ground and through the lower regions of the atmosphere. Grid fins would stabilize the booster during ascent. After all of its fuel was spent, the next stage would take over. Block B sported only a measly 8 engines, this time of the NK-15V variant, designed to work at higher altitude. Despite a significant reduction in engines, it still had enough power to get the vehicle through the less dense parts of the atmosphere. Mostly because of the 2,750 tons at launch, 1,880, almost 70% of the entire mass of the N1 were already gone. Block V, stage number 3, sported 4 NK-21 engines, again reducing the overall thrust, but now only dealing with about 12% of the total launch mass. This is something that always boggles my mind with rocket launches. To get a small amount of payload into orbit, a gigantic amount of fuel and booster material is needed. Then came the actual payload and its respective stages. Block G, the Earth departure stage. It needed only 1 engine and would be depleted after sending the lunar complex on its way. The next stage, the rather small Block D, had multiple purposes. It would first be used for course corrections on the flight to the moon. It would also perform the lunar orbital insertion and then act as a descent stage for the LK lander. After being spent, it would crash into the surface, giving way to Block Y, the actual lander engine. But let's take a step back. Before the Block D stage would start its final burn, the mission required a very peculiar maneuver. The cosmonaut designed to land on the moon would have to exit the orbital module of the Soyuz, climb down on the side of the vehicle, and then enter the LK lander before undocking it and riding it down to the moon. The man to perform this immensely dangerous task would have been Alexei Leonov, the first man in history to perform a spacewalk during the Voskhod 2 mission. Remember when he almost died and afterwards his spaceship landed in the snowy wilderness? I already highlighted the madness of that particular episode in part 2 of this series. Click on the icon up top to watch it again if you don't already have. Leonov's EVA experience was one key factor that led to him being selected for the first Soviet moon landing. Hero of the Soviet Union, sure he could have done it. Let's assume everything worked fine so far. Up until now, 5 different stages with a total of 44 engines would have had to work flawlessly, and the vehicle should be in a stable orbit around the moon. And a single cosmonaut would have to perform a very dangerous maneuver in outer space to get into the LK lander. This lander was only half the size compared to the Lunar Excursion Module used for the Apollo missions. It weighed only 6.5 tons, less than half of the American lander. It also offered only space for 1 person, which in itself was a huge risk. Even inside the Soviet Union, critics regarded the plan to land just a single cosmonaut on the moon as insane. Insane? No. Now, as mentioned before, the LK lander would ride on top of Block D towards the lunar surface. When just 1500 meters above the surface, the stage would separate and the lander's Block Y would take over and, hopefully, set the tiny vehicle safely down on the surface of the moon. The cosmonaut would then exit the LK, perform some experiments and collect soil samples. When all that was done, the ascent was triggered. The lander would ditch its landing legs assembly to save weight, but there was no dedicated ascent stage compared to the Apollo vehicle. If all went well, and that's a big if, the lander would rendezvous with the orbiting Soyuz and dock with it. Again, the cosmonaut would have to perform an EVA to get back into the safe confines of the Soyuz, reuniting with his fellow comrade. The crew would then ditch the lander and start their journey back home.
Another peculiar detail, it was thought of to leave the orbital module of the 7K depending on how much mass the retrieved surface samples would add to the vehicle. Then the cosmonauts would have to make their journey back home in the very cramped descent module.
This is the only part of the mission that could rely on proven technology, since the Soyuz at this point in time would have already had a few successful missions under its belt. Still, the capsule would have to endure higher re-entry forces compared to a regular return from Earth orbit. Imagine for a moment that this plan had succeeded, and not only that, succeeded before the Americans would have managed to land Apollo 11. Could this have slowed down the decline of the Soviet Union? What would this have done to the confidence of the United States as a nation, as a people? Let me know in the comments below. What if scenarios like this fascinate me, and I would like to know your opinion on the matter. Interestingly, there were still plans as late as 1972 for revised lunar landers, namely the L3M that would combine a Soyuz capsule with a newly developed lander vehicle. It would be 9.3 meters high and 9.4 meters wide and have a mass of 25 tons. A sort of pressurized hangar would enclose the Soyuz descent capsule, enabling the cosmonauts to leave the capsule without the need of donning spacesuits. It would require 2 launches of an upgraded N1 using liquid hydrogen for its upper stage. One would first deliver a braking stage to lunar orbit, the second would have launched the L3M, which would dock with the braking stage, essentially using it as a descent module. But this plan was scrapped with the cancellation of the N1 program. Was there ever a chance that Russia could have overtaken the Americans in the race to the moon? Again, Nikita Khrushchev's son Sergei shares some revelations, this time in an interview with the Scientific American in 2009. In it, he claims the Russians were not even close to reaching the moon before the Americans. He also believes that Korolyov's approach of building the entire N1 rocket and flying it in one piece without separate tests for each stage was doomed from the beginning. As we all know, the Americans won. Apollo 11 landed on the moon on July 20, 1969, and the space race was over. However, the Soviets did succeed in a lot of other remarkable world firsts on the moon, which I highlighted in the previous episode of the series. Again, click the icon on top to watch that. And the Russians did not stop at the moon. There were other planets to explore, other opportunities to make history. And they did. If you want to know more about that, subscribe to my channel and activate notifications. Push the bell, so you'll be updated once we continue with part 6 of Super Sekretnya Stabilnya Raketa, where we'll look at how the Soviets conquered the unforgiving hellbeast, Venus. Спасибо за просмотр. До свидания.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies. The links are in the description. Also, you can watch one of the 2 cool videos shown on the right. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.